Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we have a really remarkable assignment. I mean, it's not just a deep dive into history, it feels profoundly personal given who it's for.
It really does. It's a privilege to walk through this material, especially knowing your connection to it. Growing up in Ashley County, the words paper mill literally on your birth
And,
certificate.
and now returning, with decades of experience in the staffing industry and that deep background in industrial and organizational psychology, it's the perfect lens.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to trace what we're calling the CrossFit paradigm.
We're going to slow walk this entire 125-year story, breaking it into two very distinct eras. The first half, say 1900 to 1955, is really the story of how this town was built on revolutionary ideas of conservation.
And then the second half, from 1955 all the way to today, that's the story of its collision with modern financialized capitalism.
Right.
We're talking about a complete industrial metamorphosis, social rupture, and a final environmental reckoning that really changed everything.
Okay, so let's get into it. But to really understand the company, we can't start in 1900, can we?
No, you can't. We have to start much, much earlier. We have to deconstruct the foundational myth that the whole thing was built on.
The myth of the virgin wilderness.
The myth of the virgin wilderness. That's exactly where this deep dive has to begin. The idea that when the timber companies arrived in 1899, they found a tabula rasa.
Just an empty slate, untouched nature waiting for industry.
Right. But the sources, they tell a completely different story. The land itself, and especially those valuable pine forests, they weren't a natural accident. They were a cultural artifact.
Okay, so what does the ecological evidence actually tell us about who was there before and what they were doing?
Well, the place we now call Crossett was on the eastern edge of the ancestral Caddoan homeland. And this wasn't just a small tribe. It was a vast, complex cultural sphere that had been there for millennia.
And the Caddos weren't just living in the forest. That's the key insight here, isn't it? They were actively managing it.
They were managing it. Their primary tool was fire. It was a kind of silviculture, really. The Caddoan culture used controlled burning systematically to clear out all the dense underbrush.
And why were they doing that? What was the goal?
Two main reasons. First, to manage game. Deer, turkey. They thrive in that kind of open understory. Second, it maintained these huge, open, almost park-like stands of trees. And that practice created a very specific ecological niche.
A niche that favored one type of tree in particular.
A loblolly and shortleaf pine. They thrive in those conditions. So when the timber surveyors show up in 1899 and they see these incredible dense stands of high-value pine.
The very resource that justified building the entire town.
Exactly. What they were actually looking at to a huge degree was the legacy of centuries of indigenous land management.
That's a profound reframing.
It is. And there's another layer. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European diseases just swept through the area, way ahead of actual colonial contact. We're talking, mortality rates of up to 90%.
It's just catastrophic.
Devastating. And as a result, the Caddo had to abandon these huge agricultural fields they maintained. And what's the first thing that grows back on cleared land in that part of the world?
Pine.
Fast-growing pine. So a lot of what the Crossett Lumber Company called virgin timber was actually a very robust second growth forest that was springing up on abandoned Caddoan farmland.
So the pioneers weren't carving a town out of raw nature. They were, in a way, harvesting the unintended consequences of indigenous silviculture, which was only possible because of a massive depopulation event.
It completely challenges the town's origin story. And we also have to mention the Quapaw, the Ugapa, which means people of the downstream.
Right.
They controlled the lower Arkansas River and used all of Ashley County as vital hunting territory. They relied heavily on the rivers, the hydrology of the place.
Which brings us directly to the physical changes the industrial complex brought.
A permanent, violent disruption. To run the mill, they needed a huge, consistent source of water. So they dammed the Saline River,
Creating Lake Georgia Pacific.
creating Lake Georgia Pacific. And that single act just completely altered the water systems that had sustained people there for thousands of years. It literally washed away the physical markers of their presence.
So the whole narrative of the company town first required the erasure of the people who were already there.
The industrialists positioned themselves as creators, bringing value out of a wilderness. But that was only possible after the systematic removal of the Caddo and Quapaw to reservations in Oklahoma. You have to understand that indigenous substrate to see what comes next.
Which is the perfect pivot. Let's get into part two, that first era from 1900 to 1955. This is the period that made Crossett different, that rejection of the cut-out-and-get-out model that killed so many other towns.
Exactly. Most southern timber towns are ghosts now for a reason.
They treated the forest like a mine, a finite resource.
Crossett survived because, for a time, they treated it like a perpetual farm. And that decision, it rested on two huge, risky pillars. Get all the land you can, and then apply rigorous science to manage it forever.
Okay, let's start with the land. They began with about 50,000 acres, right?
They did, but the real genius was a man named E.W. Cap Gates. He knew that long-term forestry needed one thing above all else: scale.
So he just started buying.
Relentlessly. He grew the company's holdings to over 500,000 acres of prime timberland. That land base, that was the single most important strategic decision they ever made. It was the cushion. It let them survive when everyone else went bankrupt.
But having land is one thing. Knowing what to do with it is another, which is where Yale comes in.
Right, the Yale School of Forestry. This was the big pivot to science. In 1927, they hired their first professional forester, a guy named A.E. Wackerman.
And his job was basically to tell them to stop clear-cutting everything.
His job was to treat trees like a crop, not a commodity to be liquidated. And this whole commitment to science, it all came together in their test tube for the entire southern pine industry.
The Crossett Experimental Forest.
Established in 1934, the company donates almost 1,700 acres to the U.S. Forest Service. This wasn't some PR stunt. It was a living laboratory. They needed to prove with hard data that this idea of sustained yield could actually make money.
And the man driving that proof was R.R. Reynolds.
R.R. Reynolds, he's the intellectual architect of this whole revolution. His work famously proved the motto, "Good forestry is good business," which flew in the face of everything the industry believed.
Tell us about his Poor Farm Forestry 40 study, because that's legendary.
It is. He took 40 acres of totally depleted cut-over woodland, the kind of land everyone else had just abandoned as worthless, and through just meticulous management, only cutting the annual growth, never touching the capital stock of trees, he showed it could produce an annual financial return.
A return that was better than farming.
Often better than standard row crops like cotton. It was the hard financial proof they needed to show the board that this wasn't just some environmentalist fantasy. It was just good business.
But there was a huge practical problem. The old way of logging wouldn't work for this new selective cutting method.
Not at all. The old system was all about logging railroads. You'd lay down miles of expensive track to get to a site, clear-cut massive volumes of timber, and haul it out. Very expensive, very high volume.
And selective cutting is the opposite. It's low volume.
Exactly. You're taking out just a few trees here and there, maybe 750 board feet per acre, spread out over a huge area. It's totally uneconomical to do that with a railroad.
So the science needed a new technology to make it work.
And that technology was the gasoline-powered truck. The 1934 PAC selective logging study proved it. It showed that trucks were flexible and cheap enough to go out and economically haul those light volumes from all over the forest.
The truck basically saved sustained yield forestry.
It was the engine of sustainability. It let them finally abandon the expensive, rigid railroad system and embrace this new, more flexible philosophy.
And they also put in some really basic but critical conservation rules.
Absolutely. Starting in 1927, they mandated leaving seed trees, which the loggers called mammies. Big, mature trees that would naturally reseed the area around them.
Simple but effective.
And starting in 1928, they built a network of fire towers and phone lines to actively suppress wildfires, ending that old destructive practice of just letting the woods burn.
So the forestry innovations guaranteed they'd have trees forever. But the second pillar, full utilization, was about making sure every single splinter of those trees made money.
This is where the engineering genius really shines. Full utilization means no waste. Traditionally, when you cut a pine for lumber, you leave behind the tops, the limbs, the sawdust. It's all just left to rot.
Crossett saw that as lost revenue, and their first big move was the Crossett Chemical Company.
In 1930, right in the teeth of the Great Depression, it was an incredible move.
Oh, what did it do?
It took all that hardwood waste, the scrub oaks, the limbs, and used a process called destructive distillation. Basically, they cooked the wood in giant ovens without oxygen.
And that breaks it down into
valuable industrial chemicals. Methanol, acetic acid, wood tar. But the most famous product was what was left over.
charcoal.
Pure charcoal, which they pressed into the famous Royal Oak briquettes that were sold nationally.
So not only did it create a new revenue stream, it actually helped the forestry side of the business.
A perfect feedback loop. It created a market for the weed trees, the scrub oaks that competed with the valuable pines. So clearing them out for the chemical plant actually improved the growth rate of their main asset.
It's just brilliant systems thinking, decades ahead of its time. And then came the capstone of this whole strategy in 1937.
The Crossett paper mills. This was the final piece. And it was designed so it wouldn't compete with their main business, the sawmills.
How did they manage that?
The sawmills needed big, mature logs. The paper mill was designed specifically to use the pine thinnings.
The smaller trees that the foresters were cutting anyway to help the bigger trees grow faster.
Precisely. So now, the forestry division had a profitable place to sell every single tree they cut, big or small. It incentivized better, more intense management of the forest. It was a perfect circular economy.
And the final piece of the puzzle for this era comes in 1955 with the food board mill.
Right. That plant used a new process to blend pine and hardwood pulp to create that thick bleached board for things like milk cartons. And what that did was open up a huge market for all the low-value hardwood trees in the river bottoms that they hadn't really been able to use before.
So by 1955, you have this incredible integrated machine. Lumber, chemicals, paper, and food board, all fed by a 500,000-acre perpetual forest. It's an industrial anomaly.
It was. And it was far too valuable, far too successful to be left alone. Its very success made it an irresistible target for the next era of American business.
Which takes us right into part 3, Era 2, 1955 to 1985. This is the story of the collision between that founding paternalistic vision and 20th century financial capitalism.
And that year, 1955, is such a turning point. On the one hand, you have this massive, confident investment in the future. The new bleached food board mill, $16 million.
Embodied by that iron giant.
The Newport II paper machine, it was a Leviathan, a 217-inch wide cylinder machine. But its real importance wasn't just the size, it was the proprietary process that could pulp hardwoods like oak and gum right alongside pine.
So it basically doubled the economic value of their forest land overnight.
An absolute peak of technological integration. But in that exact same year, 1955,
the crisis of succession hits. Edward C. Crossett dies.
He was the last of the founding generation, the last one with that deep emotional commitment to the idea of a perpetual operation. His heirs, they look at their holdings, this huge illiquid asset, and they wanted liquidity. They wanted to cash out.
Which must have sent waves of fear through the town.
Profound uncertainty. In Crossett, your house, your doctor, the school your kids went to, it was all tied to the company. The fear was that a new owner would just come in, liquidate the timber, and abandon the town.
And in 1962, a new owner did come. Georgia Pacific.
GP. An aggressive, publicly traded giant. They were famous for growth through acquisition and leverage. They bought the Crossett Company for over $125 million.
And they weren't buying it for the mills, were they?
The mills were a nice bonus. They were buying the land. That 565,000 acres of perfectly managed prime timberland. It was a guaranteed resource base to fuel their national expansion.
So you have this ultimate clash of cultures. 19th century benevolent feudalism meets 20th century shareholder value.
And the change was immediate. Under the old company, the Crossett Mill was the center of the universe. Under GP, it was just the Crossett division. The philosophy was no longer about reinvesting in the local system. It was about maximizing return for shareholders, period.
But GP didn't just sit on the assets. They immediately launched an industrial revolution of their own.
Oh, yeah. They basically changed the way American houses were built. Before the 1960s, if you wanted plywood, it came from the Pacific Northwest. It was made from Douglas fir.
And the conventional wisdom was that you just couldn't make good plywood from southern yellow pine?
It was dogma. The wood had too much resin. It was hard to get the veneers to bond properly. Everyone knew it couldn't be done.
But GP was now sitting on 500,000 acres of it.
So they decided that conventional wisdom was just a technology problem waiting for a financial solution. They poured millions into R&D for new adhesives, new high-temperature drying processes.
Yeah, it worked.
It worked spectacularly. In 1964 and 65, GP opened these massive southern pine plywood mills in Fordyce and then right there in Crossett. And that broke the Pacific Northwest monopoly overnight.
It turned the South's weed trees into green gold.
Completely transformed the economics of home construction in the U.S.
Yeah.
And the economic boom in Ashley County was just immense. The demand for labor to run all these integrated plants, the sawmill, the paper mills, and now this giant plywood operation, it was huge.
Pushing the county population to its all-time peak in 1978.
Right around 26,900 people. And they even expanded the chemical plants again to achieve total vertical integration. The paper-making process creates a byproduct called black liquor soap. GP's chemical plant started processing that into something called tall oil. But crucially, they also started producing formaldehyde and the specialty resins needed for their own plywood and particle board plants.
So they were growing the trees, cutting the lumber, and literally manufacturing the glue to hold it all together.
Every single fiber was monetized. But underneath all that prosperity, the new corporate model was grinding against the old social fabric of the town.
The two were just incompatible. The old way died quietly in 1962, but the social contract that held the town together, it was officially and violently broken in 1985.
And that takes us to part 4, Rupture and Reckoning, 1985 to 2018.
You have to remember the context of the mid-'80s, a tough recession and a new, much more confrontational attitude from corporate America towards organized labor.
Right, and Georgia-Pacific, when they came to the negotiating table with the Paper Workers Union, Local 369, their main demand was for flexibility.
Now, for you, with your expertise in IO psychology, that word flexibility means something very specific, doesn't it?
It's not just about wages. It was an attack on the psychological contract. It meant getting rid of the old rigid job classifications, forcing workers to be cross-trained. It fundamentally undermined the craft identity and the sense of security that the union structure was built on.
So when the union walked out in July of '85, GP's response was unprecedented.
It was definitive and it was devastating. They immediately announced they were hiring permanent replacement workers.
In a town like Crossett, that's not just a labor dispute, that's social warfare.
It is. Suddenly you have buses of non-union workers crossing picket lines, protected by security guards. And the psychological trauma, especially when you look at it through that IO lens, was catastrophic. It was a total breach of trust.
Neighbor against neighbor, family split down the middle.
And the creation of a social stigma, the brand of scab, that would last for generations. The company proved it could run the mill without the consent of its historical, local, unionized workforce. The family was dead.
The strike itself ended pretty quickly, but the legal fight cemented GP's victory.
The union capitulated in October. The terms were brutal. Strikers could only come back if and when a replacement worker left. And in 1988, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in GP's favor, solidifying the company's right to do this.
So 1985 was the moment the relationship became purely transactional, purely about power.
Exactly. And then 20 years later, another massive shift. In 2005, Kark Industries acquires Georgia-Pacific.
And this introduces a whole new corporate philosophy, market-based management. What does that actually mean on the ground?
MBM, as they call it, emphasizes radical internal competition and relentless efficiency to maximize economic value across the entire enterprise. And this new hyper-efficient philosophy arrives just as decades of environmental complaints are about to explode into public view.
The complaints were mostly coming from West Crossett, right? Predominantly African-American neighborhoods located downwind and downstream from the mill.
For years, they had been complaining about odors, respiratory problems, what they believed was a high rate of cancer. These grievances got national attention with the 2016 documentary Company Town, which focused on this alleged cancer cluster.
But it's always hard to scientifically prove a cancer cluster in a small population.
It is, which is why we have to focus on the hard data that corroborated the risk of exposure.
And there was one piece of data that was just undeniable.
The 2011 USA Today report, the smokestack effect. It used the EPA's own data on air quality, and it ranked the elementary school in Crossett in the first percentile nationwide for exposure to airborne carcinogens.
Let's just sit with that. The first percentile. That means 99% of all other schools in the United States had a lower risk of exposure to cancer-causing chemicals.
It was a stunning validation of the community's fears, an organizational failure to protect the most vulnerable. And it also validated the complaints about the smell of money.
That foul odor that was just accepted as part of living in a mill town.
The EPA confirmed it. An inspection in 2015 found major Clean Air Act violations, illegal equipment modifications leading to uncontrolled emissions. And that smell, it was confirmed to be hydrogen sulfide, H2S, a potent neurotoxin at high concentrations.
So the community's health complaints were rooted in quantifiable illegal pollution.
And this all led to the 2018 consent decree with the EPA. Now, GP didn't formally admit liability for anyone's health problems, but the terms of the settlement were a de facto admission that things were wrong.
What were the key terms of that settlement?
Well, it was a $600,000 fine, but the big things were operational. They had to spend nearly $3 million specifically to reduce H2S emissions from their wastewater system. And most importantly, they were forced to install public-facing air monitors that transmitted data in real time.
That's a huge shift in power, giving the community the data to hold the mill accountable.
Absolutely. And this environmental reckoning, combined with new global market pressures under Koch, it set the stage for the final massive contraction of the Crossett complex.
Which brings us to Part B contraction and the new equilibrium, from roughly 2011 to today. This is where that old model of vertical integration is finally abandoned.
It had to be. In this new era of cost rationalization, that beautiful, complex, integrated system was seen as inefficient, so systematically dismantled.
And the first cut was deeply ironic, 2011.
The closure of the plywood and stud mill. The very same plant that GP had built in 1965 to launch the Southern Pine Plywood Revolution, it was gone. 700 jobs lost.
And the chemical plants, another original pillar, they were sold off piece by piece.
Divested. Sold to other companies like Ingevity and Bakelite. The plants are still there, physically, but they're owned by different corporations. The original integrated footprint is completely fragmented.
But the real death blow to the old Crossett paradigm, that came in 2019.
That was the permanent closure of the bleached board operations, the pulp mill, and the woodyard. 530 more jobs. And when they shut down the pulp mill, they silenced the Iron Giant, that #2 paper machine that had been the symbol of Crossett's power since 1955.
And losing the pulp mill and the woodyard created the single biggest change in how the place operates.
It's what we call the decoupling. This change just shatters the century-old foundation of the local economy. The mill no longer takes in raw logs from the local forests.
So what does it run on?
Market pulp. Pre-processed fiber that's shipped in by train or truck from other places. So that direct link between the local logger and the local mill, it's been severed. The mill is now just a converter of fiber, not a processor of trees.
And what's left of GP's operations has become highly specialized.
Entirely focused on the consumer products group. Tissue and towels, Angel Soft, Sparkle. It's a much more stable, less cyclical business than lumber, which is a signal of what they're trying to build now. A smaller but more stable equilibrium.
And there are signs they're committed to that new model.
Yes. In late 2024, Koch announced a $90 million investment to modernize the tissue converting lines. That stabilizes the workforce at around 550 employees. I mean, it's a shadow of its former self, but it's a lifeline. It's a commitment to a future, albeit a much smaller one.
But the final piece of this new reality is the land itself. The 500,000 acres that started it all. It's not owned by the mill operator anymore.
The land has completed its journey into a purely financial asset. GP sold its timberlands, and in 2016, Weyerhaeuser acquired them. And Weyerhaeuser operates as a REIT, a real estate investment trust.
And for you, again, with your business background, that distinction between an industrial owner and a REIT is critical, isn't it?
It's fundamental. A REIT's legal duty is to maximize cash flow for its shareholders. They manage that timber to get the highest price on the open market, period. The original Crossett Lumber Company managed the land to guarantee a supply for its own local mills. The motivation is completely different.
So the consequence for local loggers is devastating.
It is. You have the local pulp mill and plywood plant closing, and the land is now managed by a REIT selling to the highest bidder wherever they may be.
Right.
It has crushed local demand for timber. Loggers now have to haul their wood much farther, which kills their profit margins. The forest is still there, still productive, but the local economic ecosystem built to process it has been broken.
And that brings us to today. We've traced this incredible 125-year arc, from indigenous land management to the genius of sustained yield, the shock of acquisition, the trauma of the '85 strike, and now this new, contracted, specialized reality.
And for you, our listener, coming home and looking at this with your unique lens of IO psychology, you are perfectly positioned to see the human story here. The breaking of the psychological contract, the true cost of efficiency, what it means for a community to survive when its entire reason for being is rationalized away. The mill endures, but it had to sacrifice its founding identity to do so.
So we end with this final thought, this question for you to mull over. The land itself, shaped first by indigenous hands and then preserved by the pioneers of forestry, that land remains incredibly productive. But if that physical processing link to the town of Crossett has now been severed, what new forms of value, be they social, economic, or maybe even environmental, must the community now find a way to extract from that productive forest landscape in order to thrive in this new century? That's a question you are now uniquely positioned to answer.